So transition for Afghanistan essentially means that we are moving towards a target in December 2014 when NATO forces will withdraw from Afghanistan. And so the process began in July 2010, and here we see the continuum or the timeline as we move closer to full transition in 2014. We are about here in the process. So what does each of these tranches mean? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tranches. What does that mean? Well, let's just take one of them as an example. Let's take this tranche here. This is about a 12 to 18 month period. And during that period, at the very beginning of the period, the Afghan government selects certain cities, districts, provinces to begin the transition process to full ANSF lead. The process starts here, a plan is written, and the plan extends throughout the entire 12 to 18 month period until full transition has been reached at the end here. So let's talk about the plan for transition, the plan that's created for each one of these geographical areas that have been identified for transition. Well, the plan really is worked out along 4 lines of effort. At the top here we see security, which, as I've said, is the key element of it is to move towards full Afghan National Security Forces lead in that particular area that has been selected for transition. The next part of the plan, the line of effort, is governance and development. We also have strategic communications and PRT evolution. What I'd like to talk about is this one here, governance and development. Because even though this is a rather straightforward concept, moving towards security forces, partnering with the Afghan security forces to full ANSF lead, this is a little bit more difficult to understand, the governance and development part of the plan. And just before we move on to that topic, just to let you know that the strategic communications part of the plan obviously is to let everybody know what's happening, what transition is. That PRT evolution is to move the functions that a PRT had done up until this point, up until the transition point, to move those functions of the PRT into the Afghan government. So let's take governance and development and explore that a little further. So we're going to take a much closer look at governance and development in Afghanistan for transition. The way that we do that, the way that we're going to approach that, is first lay out the governance structure in Afghanistan. Because the reason we do that is because what we mean by governance and development for transition is helping government officials to take on all the functions of governance and all the functions of the government so that they are able to deliver basic services throughout the country to the people of Afghanistan. And up until this point, the international community, the donor countries, the military have been very much involved in that process. But we want to pass that over to the government, to government officials and institutions of government so that they can do it without us directly being involved in it. And so that's the idea of governance and development for transition. All right, as I said, we're going to do this, we're going to start off by building government, the structures of the Afghan government. And I would like to start off at the very bottom, at the village community level. So, as I said, we're going to build the Afghan governance structures. We're going to build them from the bottom up. So I'd like to start down here at the village at the community level. And at the village community level, essentially you have traditional structures. Really, this is where formal government ends, and you have traditional structures such as the Maliks, who are quasi-officials appointed by the district governor to sort of keep an eye on what's going on in that village as village leaders. You have the Khans, who are the landowners. You have the Mirabs, who control all of the water and irrigation systems, which is obviously essential to most of the livelihoods of the people in that village. So very influential character here. And then we also have the mullahs, very influential in the village. We also have some sort of quasi-formal structures, community development councils, and we have shuras. So this is our structure at the village level. As we move from the village up to the district, we now begin to see the formal structures of the government. And the first thing that we see in this line along here are the government officials or hired government civil servants. And they are representing their ministries in Kabul from various ministries: agriculture, education, the Ministry of Hajj and Religious Affairs, Rural Rehabilitation and Development, Women's Affairs, the Finance Ministry, the Ministry of Interior for the police, and Ministry of, let's change that, Ministry of Defense for the ANA commander, and the Independent Directorate of Local Governance. So these are your government civil servants at the lowest level in the district. They all are presided over or report up here in the district to the district governor, who's also a civil servant that's been hired through a hiring process, an official hiring process. These government officials also report up to their ministry in Kabul, so we must remember that too, that they just don't report to the governor, they actually work for their ministries in Kabul. The representative body in the district, the district council, has not been elected in Afghanistan yet. This process hasn't taken place. So instead of district council elections, or instead of district councils, the representative body of the people, there are some ad hoc or temporary structures or structures that have been set up by specific ministries to take the place of those district councils. And one example is the District Development Assembly that I've written here, and that is set up by the Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development, set up over here, and it actually is the body at the district that organizes and manages the community development councils down in the villages. Okay, so that's the structure at the district level. From the district, we move up here to the provincial level. And here we have the same structure that we see down in the district. We have the line ministries, the ministries here, with representatives from each ministry, civil servants working in those ministries. You'll see agriculture, education, the Ministry of Hajj, which is the formal mullahs that work for the government, a little different than the mullahs that you see down here in the communities. Rural development, the Women's Affairs, the Dawah, the Ministry of Finance, also known as the Mustafiyat, Ministry of Interior for the police, Ministry of Defense for the Afghan National Army, and the Independent Directorate of Local Governance. At the top of the province, the provincial governor and the representative body of the people, the provincial council. And these elections have happened in Afghanistan, and these bodies do meet, and as I said, they represent the people of the province. Oftentimes you'll see in the provincial council there's a subcommittee called the Provincial Development Council or Committee, and they are responsible for the development of the province, working closely with the governor and all the line representatives to come up with a plan for developing the province. Now, after the provincial level, we talked about the provincial level, we're going to move up to Kabul, to the central government in Kabul. And here we see exactly the same structure. We see the central ministries, and I've got them lined up along here. These are the ministries, the service ministries, and the various ministries. And at the very top, we have the president, his cabinet, the National Security Council, and again, the representative body of the people, Parliament. Now, there's something I would like to point out too, because in Kabul, there are actually about 24 ministries, and I haven't represented them all along here, but I think if I put them in here, you'll begin to realize why we don't necessarily see the same number of ministries in Kabul at the provincial or certainly the district level. So let me put one in here, and this will give you an idea. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think it was the way I had it. Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Okay? The Ministry of Mining, extractive mining, Ministry of Mines. The Ministry of Commerce. Ministry of Higher Education. Ministry of Transportation. You begin to get the picture that these are ministries that really are strategic. They're about big strategic economic development projects. They're not about service delivery at provincial and district level. There is one, however, there's a couple here that I'm going to put in. The Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Health. And I do this to illustrate a point. We have health and justice ministries in Kabul, and they're very important for service delivery. Usually you have a representative of the health ministry in the province, and also a representative of justice. But it's not necessarily true that we'll see this representation all the way down here in the district. So as I said, there are 24 ministries in Kabul. We see less represented at the province, and we see even less represented at the district level. But the fact remains is that you will see in Kabul government officials and civil servants running all of the ministries to deliver services and to develop the country with large strategic development type projects. So we've talked about the structures of government, we've talked about the people that make up the government. Now I'd like to move on to the money side of it, because as we all know that government isn't just about officials filling positions, it's also about the money flow. The wheels, or money makes the wheels of government turn. So let's turn to the discussion of money. The question is, where does the money come from to run this government structure? Well, to answer that, we have to look historically at the last 10 to 12 years. And the money has come into the Afghan government through various different sources. The first one I'd like to talk about is the money that actually comes into the Afghan government at the top, here in the Ministry of Finance. Okay? Money here, and this is money that has been moving quite successfully from the top of the government, the ministries, down through the Ministry of Finance, down to the province and the district, to pay the salaries of government officials. That's been really working quietly in the background, really working quite well, relatively well. The other source of money that is much more visible, much more talked about, a lot more press scrutiny about that source of money, is the money that we call bilateral money. So let's look at bilateral money. Let me give you some examples of bilateral money. One example might be, for example, USAID, that has paid for money directly into the district to pay for a rural road. Another example would be a PRT, who gives money from SERP to the provincial governor or the province to build a clinic or a school. That's bilateral money directly in horizontally that does not go through the ministries in Kabul. So we have what we call on-budget money here, and we have bilateral assistance or bilateral funding over here. Now, what's significant about this, and why we make a point of being very explicit about these two different funding streams going into the Afghan government over the last 10 years is because back in 2009, the Afghan government began to be very vocal about this particular funding stream, horizontal, bilateral money flowing into Afghanistan. In the press, where President Karzai, on a number of occasions, was very forthright and explicit that the PRTs were creating parallel institutions of governance. And you can actually see, let's sort of demonstrate and explore this a little bit. Let's say we have the ministry, up here we have the Ministry of Education. We have a direct linkage from that ministry all the way down through the province ministerial reps to the district ministerial reps. Well, what President Karzai was arguing was that as we put money in bilaterally, we were severing these links and we were creating horizontal government. And I'm going to draw it like that. And what we really, his point was, what we really should have been doing was helping him to govern the country by reinforcing these vertical lines of government. And several years ago, 2009, 2010, the international community, including the United States, agreed with him, began to agree with him and say, yes, you're absolutely right. This is a practice, this bilateral assistance, this is a practice that perhaps we ought to take a look at. And that's what I would like to do now, is take a closer look at this idea, the difference between bilateral funding, putting money in horizontally into the government, and the on-budget money, or the on-budget practice of putting money down through the top, down to the bottom, and creating vertical government, creating links between these different government workers and civil servants and different line representatives. So as we explore the idea of on-budget money and bilateral, or what we also call off-budget money, I'm going to write that here. I've simplified the diagram a little bit by putting the Afghan government, this represents the Afghan government that we were looking at earlier. We have the village, district, province, and Kabul. And I've shown the money flow up here, coming in through the top of the Afghan government, through the Ministry of Finance, and this is on-budget money. And I show over here the bilateral money coming from organizations like the PRT, and we call this off-budget or bilateral money. And if you recall, I described a process whereby we were creating horizontal government. And what President Karzai wanted us to do was to use this on-budget money to create vertical government. And as I said, the international community began to take a look at this and think we should perhaps begin to change our development strategy, and so that it was much more focused on putting money, US money on budget. And this began what has become known, part of this is the Kabul process. And the idea was that by putting money here into the Afghan government, if the donors did this, it would begin to develop and build the institutions of government so that Afghanistan could move much more quickly and much more effectively towards self-sustainment. Before we look at the Kabul process in detail, I want to step back a little bit and just talk about a grand strategic idea of Afghanistan moving towards self-sustainment. And I want to do this by giving you some food for thought. In 1392, this year in Afghanistan, or 2013, the budget to run the country of Afghanistan, the budget that was signed by President Karzai, is about $7 billion. $7 billion. And by the way, that's compared to the $3 trillion that the United States budget is for this year. So $7 billion budget to run the country, to pay for services, doctors, nurses, teachers, build roads, sustain buildings, provide operating budgets for districts. $7 billion total. Out of that $7 billion, the Afghans can raise from internal revenue collection, they can raise $4 billion, which of course means that there's a $3 billion deficit. And that $3 billion comes from what we call external assistance here, and it's about 40% of this budget. This is in the year 2013, or the Afghan year 1392. And I ask this question, is this the situation that a country that has aspirations towards being self-sustaining, is this the sort of situation that a country wants to be in? And of course the answer is no, it's rather an untenable situation. The decision was made under the Kabul process by the Afghan government with support from the international community that Afghanistan would develop a plan to move towards self-sustainment. And I want to put that here because it's a very important concept as we look at transition for Afghanistan. The idea is that by 2030, that Afghanistan would reduce this reliance on external assistance from 40% down to 10% reliance on donors and external assistance. So let's just walk through this example just so that we understand it completely. Let's just say that in 2030 the Afghan budget's going to be $10 billion. The idea then is that the Afghans will be able to raise $9 billion of that themselves through internal revenue collection, and that the international community, the donor community, will provide 10% of it, which is $1 billion, which is a vast reduction from the $3 billion that we see in 2013. This is a period of 18 years. This is an immense economic challenge to undertake in that period of time. And of course, a nation doesn't undertake such an ambitious economic challenge without some sort of game plan, without some sort of written agreement or written strategy to reach this economic goal. And the economic strategy that I am describing and referring to was what was developed under the Kabul process. Now, the fundamental plan to reach this goal in 2030 is a plan that was developed called the National Priority Programs, or what we know as we refer to them as the NPPs. Taking a closer look at the National Priority Programs, or as we refer to them as the NPPs, I just want to give you a little more detail on them. There are 22 of these NPPs, and they cover, each of the plans covers a various aspect of the general economic plan towards the long-term 2030 goal of self-sustainment. An example would be an NPP that is a development plan to develop the extractive industry, the mining industry in Afghanistan. This is an area of economic development that is expected to raise a lot of revenue for the country. So there is one plan that would lay out and give the objectives and the sort of mile markers, if you like, to develop that industry. Another one is to develop agriculture. Another one is to develop education. Another one to put the government on email, so that's called e-government. So that each one of these plans has been developed specifically as part of a grand strategy to reach the 2030 self-sustainment goal. They aren't aligned along single ministries, but even better than that, they're actually clustered. And so there are 6 clusters clustered around sort of things like infrastructure, agriculture, governance, and also human resource development. There are, I think, 16, I believe there are 16 of these MPPs that have been endorsed and finalized. But if you take a look at the website here, Kabul Process, you can go on this website and you can actually pull up the plans that have been completed, and you can have a look for yourself and take a look at one of these plans. So let's go back and talk about the Kabul Process. This was a dialogue, a conversation that stretched over a variety of different conferences, and probably the most important, the one that we talk about the most, because really it's where the biggest decisions were made about this goal moving towards self-sustainment, is the Kabul Conference in July of 2010. Some very important decisions were made by the Afghans and the international community at this conference. The first one was an agreement that the international donors, the ones providing the external assistance, would aim to put 50% of their funds on budget. The second big decision that was made or agreed to was that 80% of all the donor funding would be aligned to the MPPs. In other words, they would support the programs and development projects that were laid out in these national priority programs. And the third one was that the Afghan government would actually commit to writing and finishing developing these 22 national priority programs or plans. So we've looked at the 3 important decisions that were made under the Kabul process at the Kabul conference. And I would like to now go back to our model that we looked at earlier and just see what this means in real terms. What do those 3 decisions mean that were made at the Kabul conference? Well, the first thing is decision number 1, on budget money. I think we understand that it means that the donor community would put 50% of their money up here at the top into the Ministry of Finance budget for the country, and it would be dispersed across the ministries, and this is on budget money. The second agreement, which means, of course, that really means that this practice would begin to end, begin to close this down and stop this disbursement, or horizontal disbursement. The second decision was that the money would be aligned, 80% of it would be aligned to the MPPs. And the third decision was the Afghan government would begin to develop the MPPs. The national priority programs, what that really means is that across the ministries in Kabul, these clusters, these 6 clusters of ministries, would begin to write their plans for the strategic prioritization of development. And here we have, let's use red. This is where the plan lives, up here in Kabul with the ministries. So 80% of the money, donor money, would be aligned to the MPPs. What does that really mean? Let's take a look over here. If one year USAID has a budget of $2 billion, the idea then is that 50% of it here would be on budget, and 80% of it would be aligned to the MPPs and would pay for large programs to develop education, to develop health, roads, energy, they would go towards the programs in the economic development strategy, which leaves a little amount up here. If this is $1 billion, this is 1.6 billion, it would leave about 4 billion that we would call off-budget money that would still go in over here for some bilateral assistance, particularly stabilization type money that might be used immediately after clearing operations or military operations of some type. And we see that particularly in the east and the south of Afghanistan. So we still, even after the Kabul process, with an agreement to put much more money in at the top to align our money to the Afghan strategic plan, there was still money left over that we could use bilaterally, putting in horizontally for stabilization money, short-term, quick impact stabilization money. This was a situation, a new strategy, and this was the strategy that began to define the new era of transition and governance and development in transition. This ends, PRT money, bilateral money ends, and now we move towards building institutions of government and creating these vertical links, making the wheels of government turn, pushing money from the top down through each province so that officials can actually manage and spend their own money in a plan aligned to the development strategies of Afghanistan. Of course, there's one thing missing, and I really want to be very clear that if we had an economic strategy in Kabul, that economic strategy, that strategy of strategic development prioritization, has to be also linked to a plan at the provincial level and a plan at the district level. The plan at the provincial level would be the provincial development plan for that province. And obviously at the district, we would have the same thing, a district development plan. These would be plans that were aligned and nested within this grand strategic economic development plan in Kabul. And of course, the logic here is if we have 80% of donor money aligned to the MPPs up here, if these plans are not aligned and nested with the MPPs, they're really going to have little chance of being funded. So one of the big strategies for international development field practitioners of working down in below Kabul is to try to get these development plans updated and aligned to the MPPs. Every country has a budget cycle. The United States has a budget cycle. So does Afghanistan. And this is what we want to talk about because this is the process. This is the process of formulating a budget and getting the president at the end of the process to sign it. It is the process that provides government officials with their salaries, gives them money to keep the lights on, the O&M budgets, and gives them amounts of money to develop within their sector. How does it work? Right? Well, the first thing is that it's an annual budget cycle. So the budget is formed, the process begins up here December 21st, and it takes an entire year for ministries to form their budgets, and the president will sign it by December 20th. And then the money will begin to be dispersed and the cycle starts all over again. What's important about this cycle is that there is a window of opportunity here at the very, very beginning where ministries begin to formulate their budgets. And they formulate their budgets against this strategic set of priorities. So the ministries formulate their budgets, but they're going to formulate their budgets based on the plan in the MPPs. If the MPP says for education, let's say the Education for All MPP says they're going to build 100 new high schools this year, then obviously the Education Ministry is going to formulate a budget that will be able to pay for all those 100 new high schools. This is the window of opportunity for all the ministries to submit their budgets. They submit them to the Ministry of Finance, and during this period here, the Ministry of Finance will review those budgets, cap them, make sure the money is being spent according to the strategic priorities. The budget is approved by the Cabinet, the budget committees, and finally, eventually, you have Parliament in here as well. And finally, the President signs the budget. And then it's dispersed across the ministries. Once the budget has been signed and it's aligned to these priorities, to these plans, it's dispersed from the Ministry of Finance down to province and to district level for development and for O&M and for salaries. Now, the question is, if it comes from Kabul and it happens in Kabul, what role does a provincial line official have in this process? Well, there are a couple of things that a provincial line official can do. First of all, make sure that his provincial development plan is aligned to the MPPs. That's the first thing in his sector. Second thing would be to press and to interact with his ministry in Kabul to ensure that things in this plan are looked at for funding. In other words, it's sort of a lobbying role. And the third thing is that once the budgets have been agreed, this provincial official is actively involved in receiving that money, costing the project, and then dispersing that money and accounting for that money so that the project can be completed. And as you notice, this is a process that really doesn't involve the PRT at all, except perhaps in one way. Because officials have been so used to bilateral money, this process, money coming in horizontally, they have not been used to the bureaucracy and the process of receiving money from the top and spending it, and need all sorts of technical assistance and support as they learn these new systems. So I'll leave you with this final thought. As we go into transition for governance and development, we started this conversation with what does governance and development really mean. Governance and development for transition is really helping officials, Afghan officials at these levels, to be able to submit budgets, cost projects, work with their ministries in Kabul. Once the budget money is received, to be able to spend it and account for it. And this is what we mean by money making the wheels of governance turn. And if a PRT or civilians can find an area of that process where they can provide some sort of assistance, or at the very least not undermine that process from working, this is the sorts of activities we should be undertaking in this transition period.